Okay, guys, good morning to you. Yesterday, my voice kind of gave out before I had really finished the lecture. So I need to speed up a bit today. Just bear with me. This is not going to be a slow lecture. I'm going to have to keep you here until the bitter end, because this is in fact your last Tempest lecture. So it's in some ways quite an important one. And I will almost certainly devise my test question for you based on something that we covered today. I'm also recording the lecture using this newfangled technology, so I'm not going to make it publicly available, but if you email me, I'll send you a link to it. And I'm also being kind in the sense that those of your friends who are not at the lecture will also be able to see what we're talking about today. All right, so very quickly, when I saw you last time, I drew this distinction, right, between performative and descriptive speech, which is a distinction that was identified by the speech act theorist J.L. Austin. And I said to you that Prospero's discourse is remarkably performative. In other words, his words do things. His stories are never just stories. Words are his power. You know, his authority kind of comes from his authority. And very directly, as Caliban realizes, also from his books. You know, Caliban knows that if you burn Prospero's books, he loses all his power. His words literally have a kind of magical potency. They can literally shape reality. So in some ways it's metaphorical, you know, words have the power to shape reality, but in certain ways in the sort of magical world of the Tempest, it's also literal. And one of the things he does at the end of the play is to abandon his books. So when he sails back to the real world, to resume his public duties, he forgoes his magic power. Now, as a very quick aside, I just want to say, in these lectures, I'm kind of making Prospero sound like a villain, right? As if he's this dictatorial person who controls everybody and shapes their reality and enslaves people and so on. And to a large degree, it's true. But a Renaissance audience would not necessarily have read him in that way. I mean, there's a more sympathetic way of reading Prospero as well, as the embodiment in some ways of a humanist individual, you know, someone who's capable of placing reason above passion, someone who in the final instance is capable of forgiving instead of exacting vengeance. So conventional reading of the play would be much softer on Prospero than we are in these lectures. What I'm really trying to do, though, is to show you that there's a different way of reading the play. And it's not just something that I'm imposing on the play from a modern point of view. I'm trying to show you how in Shakespeare's play itself, if you look at it carefully, if you deconstruct what's going on, there are these questions really about the nature of Prospero's authority and where it derives from and how it works. In the play itself, there's something a little bit sinister about the figure of Prospero. We really only have his word, actually, for almost everything that we know about the island and what happened before he arrived on the island. If you think about it carefully, it's a strange play in the sense that so much of it kind of happens off stage. His exile is something that we learn about from Prospero when he tells his daughter about it. Everything we know about Sycorax, the witch, Caliban's mother, we know from Prospero. He tells us about her. We know that Ariel was trapped in a tree for 12 years. What kind of tree? Can you remember? Trivial pop quiz. A pine tree. He was trapped in a pine tree for 12 years. And then interestingly kind of made him into his indentured servant for 12 years. So even though he liberated him, he also kept him in, I guess, a situation of bondage. I wouldn't say Ariel is his slave in the same way that Caliban definitely is his slave. And obviously you can't really equate the two things. Being trapped in a pine tree for 12 years is not quite the same thing as being someone's indentured servant for 12 years. But it is interesting that there's this parallel. Do we know why Sycorax imprisoned Ariel in the tree? We don't actually. There are these weird omissions in the play. Because the only thing we have is we have Prospero's words. His remarkably performative words. His language ultimately has all the authority in the play. And the reality that we encounter is very much Prospero's reality. He decides what to tell us and what not to tell us. And, you know, I don't think that's just a mistake. It's not that Shakespeare kind of forgot to include other voices. It's a deliberate choice. It is a play about what you could call a kind of monological discourse, a single voice, and its capacity to control. And also, of course, its capacity to contain transgression and to even use transgression in order to effect certain aims, to achieve certain goals. Right, so that was the one thing I foregrounded before I couldn't talk anymore yesterday. There's this distinction between performative and descriptive speech, which I think is important. And then I also talked to you a little bit about what we can call the difference between a humanist and the constructivist view of what it means to be human. So when Shakespeare was writing this play, the Renaissance, humanism as a philosophy was ascending to a very sort of prominent position in philosophical and public discourse. I identified Pico as, one early proponent of humanist philosophy, but of course there are others, Ficino, for instance, and so on. And we looked at this idea of man as a creature of indeterminate and indifferent nature, who's at the very center of the world, who decides what shape he can take, who decides whether to elevate himself into a higher being, or whether to degrade himself into a lower form of life. So, it's this idea that the self, the individual, is at the very center of the cosmos, and that the individual, every single person, has this remarkable capacity, this incredible power to invent his or sometimes her own reality, and to make of themselves whatever they want to. So here you see it very clearly in Pico's description, where he says that we have made you neither of heavenly nor earthly stuff, so that with free choice, this is a very important aspect of humanist philosophy, you have freedom of choice, you have reason, so with free choice and dignity, you may fashion yourself into whatever form you choose. So this is the one side of Prospero. Prospero the humanist. Prospero is the embodiment of this idea of man that Pico gives us in the 1400s, in the 15th century. But then I said to you, if you look at that speech, right, where he talks about the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, Everything will dissolve. It's an insubstantial pageant. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. Our life is rounded by a sleep. I'm weak. And, you know, right at the end of the play where he says, I have no power, you have all the power. If you don't applaud me, then I will die. I will not enter history. Here he seems to be saying that he's constructed, to use a modern term. This is quite a constructivist point of view, which you could actually place in diametric opposition to this humanist point of view advanced by Pico. I mean, this idea of what it means to be human, I guess, is a much more modern one. This is sort of what you encounter when you come to university, who identity is constructed, and you know, there are systemic forces that kind of mediate our sense of self, and we're not really as free as we think, and the individual is not defined by his or her capacity for reason, but in fact rather by unconscious forces that shape us, and so on and so forth. I mean, you'd have heard this in English, in anthropology, in sociology, etc., etc. What is interesting is that even in Shakespeare's own time, people were experimenting with this idea. In other words, we think of it as a kind of a modern idea. But if you look at Montaigne, for instance, who wrote his essays in the 1580s in French, wonderful book. I actually read Montaigne's essays for fun in translation. I love Montaigne. If I could choose one dead person to bring back to life to have a dinner, to have at my dinner party, it would be Montaigne, not Shakespeare. He's just awesome. And he's just like this beautiful human person. It's incredible to kind of encounter someone writing in the 16th century who seems so fully alive, who you can kind of relate to at this absolutely human level. So I sometimes agree with him, I sometimes disagree with him, but it's kind of the way you agree or disagree with a friend. I mean, this guy lived in the 16th century. It's amazing. So here's just two extracts from this remarkable essay he wrote called Of Custom, and the argument he makes really is a constructivist argument. He doesn't use words like ideology and so on because they didn't exist yet. He uses words like custom and habit and so on in order to say that we are who we are because of the customs of our society. We're not as free or as powerful or as rational as we think. So here are just two little quotes from his very lengthy chapter on custom. Look how radical this is. The laws of conscience. Imagine saying this in a kind of a Protestant or at least a very Christian environment in the 16th century. The laws of conscience, which we pretend to be derived from nature, and you could put in brackets there from God, right? Because God is supposed to give you your conscience. But Montaigne is careful because he doesn't want to offend anyone. The laws of conscience, which we pretend to be derived from nature, proceed from custom. In other words, your sense of what's right and wrong is actually socially constructed. He's writing this in 1580. It's remarkable. Everyone having an inward veneration for the opinions and manners approved and received amongst his own people cannot without very great reluctance depart from them, nor apply himself to them without applause. He's saying it's very difficult to kind of identify the sense in which our sense of morality is in fact socially mediated. That's what he's saying here. Directly. I'm not even, really translating it into something more radical than what he's actually saying here. And further on in the same essay, he says, "'Tis by the mediation of custom that everyone is content with the place where he is planted by nature." This is a very unmedieval kind of thing to say. So this idea where everyone has his or her proper place, all the animals, all the people, it's preordained, God put you where you're supposed to be. He's saying, no, it's the mediation. He even uses the word mediation, which is a very modern word. It's by the mediation of custom, call it ideology if you want, that everyone is content with the place where he's planted by nature. This is what later Marxists like Gramsci would call hegemony, right? It's the way in which your culture kind of makes you content with your lot in life as if it's your free choice, rather than something that you are systemically subjected to. So 16th century, before, this is 20 years before Shakespeare wrote The Tempest, you already have people playing with these kinds of ideas. So here you have one view, the view of man as, you know, a creature with agency, center of the world, most powerful and sublime thing. And here you have a view of people as essentially constructed through habits and through customs and by ideology. And Shakespeare would have been aware of this, in case you're wondering. He did read his Montaigne. And you can go back even further, right? Go back to Lucretius and his incredible book on the nature of things, written in classical antiquity in ancient Rome. In fact, you know, one of the things about the Renaissance is that people rediscovered Lucretius, because the church really didn't like, the Catholic Church really didn't like Lucretius. He didn't believe in God, for one thing. Well, he didn't believe in the gods because, you know, he was writing in Rome. He didn't believe in an afterlife. He posited the existence of atoms, of very small particles. He posited the second law of thermodynamics. You know, he was an astonishingly modern thinker. And he says, if the world is the product, after arguing that the world is the product of nothing but natural forces, if the world is the product of nothing but natural forces and natural law, then divine intervention is impossible. So he's dismissing the idea of divine intervention. And just in case you thought evolution, you know, kind of sprung fully fledged from Darwin's forehead in the 19th century, look at what this guy is saying, 50 BC, right? Another fallacy comes creeping in whose errors you should be meticulous in trying to avoid. Don't think our eyes, our bright and shining eyes, were made for us to look with. Don't suppose our thigh bones fitted our shin bones and our shins our ankles so that we might take steps. Don't think that arms dangled from shoulders and branched out in hands with fingers at the ends, both right and left, for us to do whatever need required for our survival. All such argument, all such interpretation is perverse, fallacious. It puts the cart before the horse. No bodily thing was born for us to use. Now, imagine someone actually saying this. He's saying there's no creator that made you in a way that kind of anticipates what you might need to use your body for. It's all just accidents. Nature had no such aim, but what was born creates the use. There could be no such thing as sight before the eyes were formed, no speech before the tongue was made. The tongues began long before speech were uttered, and the ears were fashioned long before a sound was heard. So I'm pulling out Lucretius because he was also very widely in circulation in the Renaissance. This is the kind of stuff people were reading, and it was informing their philosophy. And I'm saying this to you yet again to say I'm not imposing some kind of modern debate, you know, nature versus nurture or whatever, onto Shakespeare's play. This debate was in fact current in the Renaissance already. And the Tempest enters that debate. So it's actually trying to show us something without being didactic about it. Now, the figure where I think, you know, this is where this kind of debate is most clearly kind of constellated around is Caliban. So the first thing to notice, of course, is that there are strange similarities between Sycorax, right, the evil witch that we never meet and who we only know is evil because Prospero tells us so. She was also banished to the island. She also made a new home on the island with her child, in her case Caliban. Um, and in Prospero's case with Miranda, they both ruled the island for 12 years. They also kept Ariel in bondage for 12 years. They used magic to control others. I'm not sure about driven by rage and revenge. According to Prospero, Sycorax is driven by rage and revenge. Prospero at the beginning of the play certainly seems to be driven by desire for revenge, but at the end of the play, right, he seems to kind of embrace the idea of mercy as a better way of resolving conflicts. So there's something sort of strangely similar about the two of them, actually. Now, a Renaissance audience would have understood that Caliban belongs to a certain kind of category of creature, and this creature was called various things, but most generally it was called a wild man. And Renaissance people really believed, right, that there were wild men all around. In fact, early colonists who arrived in places like India and the Far East and Africa thought that what they were seeing were wild men. So they had a kind of a preconceived idea, this template that they then used in order to understand the people that they encountered. So, you know, a wild man is a person, it's actually a human who, having degenerated into beastliness, has no knowledge of God and consequently no right reason. By God, they mean the Christian God. Nor has he any true language. At best, he can mutter a few intelligible sounds. You see, you know, the Dutch and their first encounter with the indigenous people at the Cape, they thought that the Khoisan people didn't have a language. They really thought they were just going ko, which is where these derogatory words like Hottentot comes from. It's actually onomatopoeic. It's like the people that go ko. You very often find that in othering, by the way. You know, that there's this idea that these people don't have a real language. And then you call them by your own kind of satirical approximation of what their language sounds like to you. Like in South Africa, makwere for a foreigner. It's just what French sounds like if you don't know French. Quere. That's where it comes from, that is etymology. Okay, but the wild man, and I think this is interesting, the wild man has some extraordinary powers that civilized humans do not have. So even though civilization liberates us in many ways, there are also things it takes away from us. With the removal of society's restraints, the degenerated man has superhuman strength, sexual prowess, and knowledge of nature's secrets. The wild man opposed and rejected civilization, its values and beliefs, its virtues and its order. And to that, I think one can add that it's not just that the wild man opposed and rejected civilization, but that civilization could define itself as civilized, in contrast to the wild man, to this person who rejected civilization. In order to have civilization, you kind of need to be able to point to someone and you need to say, well, that's what it looks like not to have civilization, yes?
Which one do they think came first? Because they call him the degenerated man, which means they think civilized man came first.
Look, I think it's, you know, it's part of this humanist belief that, which in fact is quite a democratic belief, that all people, irrespective of where they live or who they are, do have this capacity to uplift themselves through reason. And wild men were really just, you know, people who had this capacity but then squandered it for whatever reason.
So you all started civilized.
Everyone starts, you know, and this is that modern democracy is based on this assumption, which is a humanist assumption. Actually, I shouldn't say everyone, because there were distinctions between men and women. So there was this idea that, you know, women were less capable of controlling their passions. which is also one of the reasons why Prospero is so obsessed with the idea of the virgin knot. He's constantly trying to subdue the life of the body and of passion. And in all Shakespeare's plays, desire, plays this kind of disruptive role. It's as if in order to make desire safe, you have to sanctify it through social ritual, the ritual of marriage and so on. Desire always poses a problem. And Prospero kind of sets himself up almost as the antithesis of desire. He stands in the space of reason. Now, I mean, you can recognize this as very typical of the way othering works, right? What we're talking about here is othering. If you could take your mind back to first year, we talked about othering a bit. Othering is one of the ways of defining othering is you take things that you don't like about yourself, you repress them, and then you project them onto someone else. You take things that you don't admit, that you can't admit about yourself, and in order to have a stable identity, in order to be able to say, this is who I am, you have to be able to point to someone else and say, well, this is who I am not. So you project all these negative characteristics on another person. And the less powerful that person is, of course, the more successful this projection becomes, because that person can't really speak back. Certainly, Prospero is projecting something onto Caliban, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. But Caliban is interesting because he talks back. And one of the things that really disturbs Caliban is that the only language he has in order to talk back is the language of the colonizer. You taught me words and my profit on it is I know how to curse. So he's kind of, in a sense, a figure of resistance, but he's frustrated by the fact that the medium he has to resist Prospero is a medium that Prospero himself gave to him. So, the Renaissance and the late medieval age was full of stories about these strange creatures that travelers said they had encountered in foreign lands, in the East, in Africa. So here's Sir Walter Raleigh with his picture of the Blemier that he says he found when he was searching for the mythical city of El Dorado. People without heads but with faces on their chest. Here's the Mandeville and his cynocephali, people with the heads of dogs. You had lots of people claiming that they discovered Amazon tribes. There was an obsession with cannibals. So these travelers in the late medieval period and in the early modern period all came back with stories about their travels, and these were like the bestsellers of the time, right? They were snapped up. People loved them, partly because they talked about this marvelous kind of spectacular, bizarre world outside Europe. It fulfilled a kind of almost a voyeuristic instinct that people had, a fascination with what you could call the spectacular. Do you think they were just lying? If I can interrupt my very fast lecture briefing. I mean, I'm sure they didn't really discover people with the heads of dogs, right? It's a difficult question to answer. Obviously, to a certain degree, they were just lying. I mean, like today, this kind of thing sold books. So the more outlandish the stuff was that you said you found, the more books you would sell. In fact, these are archetypes that go back to Greek antiquity already. So, the ancient Greeks already divided the different kind of races of the world into people with dogs' heads and so on. You know, there was a ready-made template that people in the Renaissance had in their mind, and they kind of, whatever it is they saw, they just managed to fit into this template. So if you want to be charitable, you could also say that, well, they noticed people with different customs, people who looked differently physically, people who wore masks perhaps, and they didn't realize that these were masks. It's entirely possible that they simply kind of, because they had this ready-made image of the other, that they just kind of plugged whoever they saw into this template that they already had. And I would say part of the reason for this fascination with the other and the spectacular other in the Renaissance had to do with the fact that Europe was in a state of upheaval. You know, the Catholic Church in many places was losing its purchase on power. You had a series of devastating wars. You had the rise of the middle class, which until the early modern period hardly existed at all. Very small middle class, but you know, people were starting to become rich through trade, rather just because they were born into an aristocratic family. People came into contact with ancient civilizations that had advanced technology. I mean, China, for instance, was way ahead technologically of Europe at the time. And here were people who didn't believe in the same things that European people believed in, and they didn't even believe in the same gods, but they were doing spectacularly well, and they were coming up with all these incredible inventions. Like, for instance, the printing press, which was not invented by Gutenberg in the 16th century. It's a Chinese invention. Or gunpowder, which was invented in China. So, you know, Eastern civilization, to a large extent, became a kind of a source of awe and wonder for European people. And inevitably, when that happens, you begin to relativize your own experience. You say, well, all these things that I've always thought are right and immutable and natural, are they really? Because here are people doing things completely differently, and they seem to be doing just fine. They look weird to me, but I bet you I look weird to them. I mean, literally, people literally said this. So you look at Montaigne, you know, a large part of his essay on custom is actually about where he tries to imagine being someone who's not European, looking at European customs and thinking how bizarre they are. So you kind of you know, what you have is this sort of process of defamiliarization. And at the same time, the erosion of a kind of ontological stability that had remained almost unchanged for thousands of years. So what do people do? You could say they were experiencing an identity crisis, if you want. What do people do when they experience an identity crisis? Well, they begin to create others. It's almost always in historical periods where you have sort of big social historical identity crisis, you have this proliferation of images of the other. Because it's a way of saying, look, I know things are a freaking mess here, and we don't really know what's going on anymore, and there are wars and all this stuff we used to believe about the great chain of being suddenly doesn't seem to make so much sense anymore. But, you know, at least we're not ruled by women. At least we don't have the heads of dogs. So you point to someone else and you say, well, what defines us in this time of crisis is that we're not that. And, you know, for me, that's a trans-historical and trans-cultural phenomenon. Whenever a society is in crisis, you kind of find someone, you could call it a scapegoat if you want. But it fulfills a deeper psychological need, which is the ability to be able to say who you are. I am what I am because I am not you. The other becomes like this kind of negative thing that you can measure yourself against. One of the things that is weird about Prospero's relationship with Caliban is that it seems strangely intimate considering how much he hates him. purportedly. Now remember the logic of othering. You take something that you don't like about yourself and you project it onto someone else. You know, you like grow up in a full-on, like, hectic, poisonously masculine society where the idea of same-sex love is, you know, something that will make your parents' head explode. And you're attracted to other men. To your horror, you're a man. What do you do with it? Well, you repress it as much as you possibly can. You absolutely deny it. And you project it onto other people, who you then go and beat up because, you know, homosexuals are so disgusting and so awful and so terrible that you need to eradicate them. You're actually beating yourself up, right? You're taking something that doesn't fit with your own idea of what it means to be a man, to be a self, that you find unbearable. And you externalize it as a kind of violence that you direct towards this other. Look at how he describes, Prospero describes Caliban, this misshapen knave. His mother was a witch, and one so strong that could control the moon, make flows and ebbs, and deal in her command without her power. These are very feminine things, actually, the moon, the tides. I mean, it's interesting, you know, how part of what makes her so terrible is actually that she seems to be in control of a certain kind of femininity. Or at least natural elements that have always been associated with women. And then he says, these three have robbed me, so that's the two servants, Stefano, Triculo, and then Caliban. And this demi-devil, for he's a bastard one. The idea of bastard always comes up in the play. Bastard means you're illegitimate. It's not just a swear word. In fact, he's also, the question of Miranda's legitimacy also comes up at one point. She says to him quite rhetorically at one point, "Sir, are you not my father?" And he responds to her kind of jokingly. He says, "Well, you know, your mother told me so, and she's a woman of virtue, so I guess I am your father." This is a slightly humorous moment in the play, but you know, this idea of legitimacy and the legitimacy of the male line is really important. And the worst thing you could say about someone is that they're a bastard, that they don't have a clear kind of provenance, that they don't have a legitimate line. By the way, how does your mother know you're her child? How could she be sure? Duh. She gave birth to you, right? I mean, I'm sure your mother knows that you are her child because you have an umbilical cord that linked you to her that had to be cut. Your father, on the other hand, can never really be sure, right? And I guess these days you can do DNA tests. Yes?
Very far-fetched, but what's the chances that Caliban is Prospero's license? Cigarettes. If I acknowledge mine.
It's not completely impossible. And it's weird that he uses this idea of a bastard in this context. You know, where does it come from? Who is it that cigarettes? Don't put this in your essay, okay? This is like really kind of, yeah, it would be very difficult to substantiate that, but why not? It's entirely possible. You know, the only way your father knows that you are his child is because your mother told him so. And I think, you know, patrilinealism, in other words, having your father's name is kind of, it almost substitutes for the biological reality of the umbilical cord. To carry the name of your father is a sort of a linguistic substitute for this biological thing, right, that binds you to your child. And the issue of legitimacy is always really important in Prospero's world, which is very much a world about words. And then he says, two of these fellows you must know and own, that's Trincula and Stefano, they're yours. This thing of darkness, Caliban, I acknowledge mine. It's a fascinating way of saying it. I mean, he could just be saying, I'm responsible for Caliban. But there's something about the resonance of this line that makes it seem as if he's acknowledging a deeper connection to Caliban than one might think, that this thing of darkness is actually a part of myself. There have been some Freudian kind of readings of this play, which I'm not going to go into, but some Freudians have said, oh, Ariel is the superego, and Prospero is the ego, and Caliban is the id, the sort of dark, elemental, instinctive force, and that actually, what Shakespeare's presenting to us is just the three facets of a single personality. And, his reason for treating Caliban the way he does is because he's a devil. And it's really important that he's a born devil, on whose nature, there's the nature-nurture debate for you, long before you thought anyone was having it. A born devil on whose nurture can never stick, on whom my pains humanely taken, all lost, quite lost. So Caliban is by nature, he is just this evil beast. And I tried through nurture to teach him to be, I guess, a civilized person, but I couldn't. So this is a complicated thing to say, because on the one hand he seems to say, well, Caliban should be grateful, that's like the old colonial refrain, and why aren't people thankful for all these things that we try to do for them? But on the other hand, Prospero kind of needs Caliban to be a devil by nature, because then he can define himself in opposition to Caliban. If it belongs to nature, then it doesn't mean that Caliban could just as well have been Prospero. It just depends, right, on circumstances. He kind of biologizes it. He says it's something that belongs to the order of nature, and that's quite self-serving for Prospero, because it allows him, first of all, to define himself as civilized, and secondly, it allows him to use Caliban's labor. So even though it looks like a complaint, right, it's also a form of self-definition. He's kind of almost saying, what defines me as civilized is the fact that I couldn't civilize Caliban. I'm not going to talk about this now, except to say that it is interesting the way in which he seems to kind of invade Caliban's head the whole time. So even when Prospero's not there, Caliban keeps hearing voices and noises, and it's like this kind of ideological noise that kind of fills his head, in addition to the language that Prospero taught him. And I already talked to you a little bit about, we drew that link to what Ngugi has said many hundreds of years later about language as communication that carries culture, and culture carries, particularly through origin and literature, the entire body of values by which we perceive ourselves and our place in the world. You see why post-colonial critics like the Tempest. I mean, Caliban seems almost like the living embodiment of this idea that language comes with values and cultural assumptions, and that by teaching Caliban his language was in fact internalizing these values that make him into a monster. Values that right up to the end of the play tries to resist. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. Just stay with me. Have you ever noticed when you read Renaissance plays that subtitles like here, you see, you said our work should cease, and then I did say so starts towards the right of the line. Do you know why that is? You also see that the numbering gets a bit weird around instances where this happens, yeah?
It might not be as much because he waits a while.
He might wait a while, but in fact, what's happening here is, that this is all written in iambic pentameter. So you have 10 syllables, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, that's one line. And what's actually happening here is that you said our work should cease. That's not a complete line. And then Prospero completes his line. I did say so. So you have to take these two together as one line. And if you look at the numbering in your play, they'll say this is line 5, and this is also line 5, and this is line 6. So they would count this as one line. And I just want to draw, this idea that Prospero is so forgiving and so on. I want to draw your attention to the fact that, in fact, it's Ariel who persuades him to forgive everyone. And he does it almost by kind of completing his sentences for him. It's as if they're speaking as the same person right here. Now this my project gathered to a head, says Prospero. This whole play happens, in one day, which is very unusual for Shakespeare. It's the 6th hour. What does that make you think of? The number 6, a project that has to be completed. The world was supposedly created in 7 days, right? So he's occupying the position of God here. And then just here, your charm so strongly works them, says Ariel, that if you now beheld them, your affections would become tender. So he's saying, you would be sorry now for everyone if you could see them. And Prospero says, dost thou think so, spirit? And Ariel says, mine would, sir, were I human. So I don't feel anything because I'm not human, but I would be moved. And then Prospero says, and mine shall. So he's kind of saying, well, I am human, so, if you would be moved if you were human, then of course I have to be moved, because I am human. It's fascinating to see how, in this scene, Ariel kind of very subtly manipulates Prospero into saying something that he didn't really mean to say. Ariel is very clever in this way. All right, folks, I think there were like 3 other things I wanted to say, but I think we can survive without them. So that's it for me. See you again later.